Stacy, thank you for the introduction. I'm super happy to be here with you all. I think, I've worn a lot of different hats in my professional life, and I think the one that probably informs my work the most is actually my role as a parent. Like Stacy said, I have 4 kids. 3 of them are teenagers, 18, 16, and 13. And so I am really doing this parenting work alongside each of you. So, Stacy, do you want to start us off with our first question?
Yes, I would love to. So, as Andre said, this is a perfect time, spring. The weather is glorious, so it's perfect for this talk. As we approach spring, it will surely bring more opportunities for our teens to gather outside with their friends. Andre, can you talk to a little bit about how can we balance our teens' social needs with our own family's rules and guidelines?
Okay, so let's talk a little bit first about why our kids' friends are so important to them, right? Outside of the usual suspects, like having fun with them and, feeling like you belong, our kids' friendships are actually really important to their developing sense of self, right? So part of becoming an adult and moving through adolescence is going through what we call this process of individuation. And in that process, our kids start to basically try on different roles, right? They start imagining what kind of adults are they going to become. And they can't really do that or go through that process if they remain too tethered to us, okay? So instead, one of the most important ways our teens begin to get a sense of who they are and who they want to become is through their association with their peers, okay? And it's in these relationships that our kids start to try on and develop really important parts of their identity. I mention that because it can be an important reminder for us as parents of teenagers about why our kids tend to push hard when it comes to spending time with their peers, right? And also why we as parents really need to work with our kids to figure out ways for them to be together, okay? Now here's the rub. We're moving into springtime. I think spring 2021 is going to look and feel obviously very different than spring 2020. We still have to prioritize the health and safety of our kids, right? And their friends. And in doing so, I think that's going to most likely prevent us from allowing our kids complete freedom when it comes to their socializing, okay? Additionally, I think we're moving into what I feel is an even harder space in terms of parenting because there's a lot of things that are changing in our landscape, right? We can feel Connecticut is already starting to loosen up. We're watching on the news other states lifting restrictions. Families are operating from very unique spaces. Some families have a caregiver or a parent who's been vaccinated. Some families have had COVID. Some families have not had COVID, right? And so everybody's operating from sort of a different mindset. And I think that is going to make it tricky for our kids in terms of their socializing, but even more tricky for us as parents as we kind of navigate this process with them. So here are just a few thoughts about how we can manage some of these variables that I hope will work for each of our own families. And I'll use myself as an example here, right? So in thinking about the next few months, I'm going to want to really drill down on my non-negotiables about social interactions that really prioritize the health and safety of not only my kids, but their peers, okay? So therefore, I'm going to need to be really clear and explicit with my teenagers about the things they can do and the things they can't do, okay? So for example, in my house, I am comfortable with my kids going to their schoolmates' houses because they're all in school together, okay? But a non-negotiable in our house is you can't go to somebody's house who is not a schoolmate, okay? So whatever that looks like for each of you, my point is, I think it's going to be an important time as we move into spring, as our kids are going back to school, which is great news. I just heard that for you all. As they're gathering more outside because the weather allows, I think we're going to have to really think carefully about what are those few non-negotiables as they relate to our family that prioritize our kids' health and safety. Okay. So here's the key. The key is going to be explicit. And what do I mean by that? Be really clear about what your expectations are. Our kids, especially teenagers, I think they're better able to keep themselves in safer spaces if they are very clear about what's expected. Okay. The second thing, be inviting. What do I mean by that? Look for ways for your teenagers to call some of the shots as it relates to their social lives. Okay. And that's can feel sometimes tricky because it doesn't seem like there's a lot of negotiation room in there, but any opportunity your kid has to be calling the shot around their social life, that's an important opportunity for them. And then finally, just being flexible. I think with the ever-changing landscape, we are going to need to be more flexible than ever. And so what that means is, on one hand, I'm like, tighten up around your non-negotiables, but be flexible, because what may work in your family one week may not work in the second week. And I think our kids also need to understand that we're going to be revisiting these rules as we move through the spring. Okay. I also think as our older teens become vaccinated, right? I think 16 to 24, they're lined up for the beginning of May. I think that's going to present an even like a changing landscape again as we move into summer. So I think flexibility is going to be really key here. Stacy, how does that answer your question? Anything coming up for people around this?
Well, I think that was a great answer. And also something that you mentioned in terms of having our teens call the shots. With that being said, if they're doing that, they're obviously making decisions. And sometimes they may not take into consideration their consequences or how their decisions may impact others. So any thoughts on how we can effectively support them in calling the shots, but also then in turn helping them make the good decisions?
Great question. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about our teens, right? So their brain development is such that their prefrontal cortex, which sits at the front of their brain, that's like their CEO, okay? Our prefrontal cortex is developed in an adult brain. It is developing in an adolescent brain. In fact, it's not really fully developed until their mid to late 20s. Okay, so our high school kids, that process is still very much in development. They don't have adult capabilities in terms of long-term planning, things like cause and effect. Okay, they interpret many of their experiences through an area of their brain called the amygdala, which sits closer to the back of the brain. And our amygdalas are the part of our brains that trigger our body's fight or flight response. Okay, it serves almost like an alarm system for our bodies. Okay, and so our teenagers process a lot of their experiences through this area of their brain. And we know that in doing so, their responses tend to be impulsive, right? And highly reactive. Okay. So as a result, our teens have this amazing ability. I don't know if you see this in your home, but I definitely see this in my home. They have this great ability to overestimate the positive outcomes and really underestimate the negative ones. Okay. So that doesn't mean we let them off the hook with decision making. In fact, adolescence is a critical time for our kids to be practicing making decisions. Okay. So how do we do that? Two of my favorite sort of back pocket phrases here. The first one is asking your kid, hey, what's your plan? Okay. And what does that look like? That looks like helping them talk through kind of the steps that they're going to take. If you can imagine a situation where you would say that to your teenager, that looks like saying it and then helping them to sort of talk out the steps helping them to anticipate the roadblocks, right? What are going to be the barriers? What's going to come up for you that may challenge you? And then what are ways that you can overcome those, right? Helping our kids kind of tap into their inner resources. So that's my first kind of back pocket. I love using that, especially with my older teenagers, okay? The second one is just saying something like, hey, it's your call. And now I don't use that freely, right? I use that when I'm super comfortable with all the choices on the table. So if my teenager has to make some decisions for themselves and we've talked through the choices, then I'll say, hey, you know what? This is going to be your call. And that can be a really empowering opportunity for a kid. One, I'm giving my kid the message that I have faith in their decision process, right? I have that confidence. And I also kind of go quiet after I say that because I want to create some space for them to sort of listen to their own thinking process, okay? Really important as they develop that skill of making decisions. And then the last is a strategy that I use, not only in my practice, but in my own family, which is this idea of plan B thinking. So our teenagers are really good at making plan A, right? But like I explained with the way their brains are developing, plan B is not usually on the table. So we need to help them put it on the table. And one of the ways we can do that is to help them think about, what are some alternatives? What are some things that you should be thinking about if plan A does not work for you? What's going to be plan B? And in that process, they're actually practicing good decision making. Okay. So 2 great back pocket phrases and a strategy. Stacy, is that helpful?
That was great. I think that's awesome. I like the plan B thinking, having a backup plan, something really important, I think, for teens and even us as adults to really kind of think about as we make decisions.
Definitely.
Something we've been hearing, Andre, is parents, kids are burned out, emotional exhaustion. I've been hearing, I'm just done, I'm done. So my question is, can you mention some easy and practical ways we can invest in our relationship with our teens, especially when we're feeling burned out or they come to us and we're just exhausted and feel like not right now, but we know they need us?
I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just kidding. Yeah, I think we can all relate to this, right? We are like, the fatigue is like for real. And I think especially for parents. So let's just talk about some really easy things that are critical to building our relationship with our teenagers. And the first that I have here is, which I think some of you may think is odd, but just hear me out, is this idea of stepping out and stepping away. And what do I mean by that? I mean, we cannot really parent to the best of our abilities when we are running on empty. And I think for a lot of us, we are running on empty, okay? So I'm encouraging parents to kind of use the spring with the great weather to step out and away from your kids, right? And I understand there are some limitations to that. And I don't mean for weeks or months, even though that sounds really lovely, but even just for an hour or 2 or 20 minutes on a weekend day, right? And here's why, because I think when we have time alone, and whatever you use and do in that time alone is obviously up to you, but that time alone away from our families serves 2 really important things. One, it helps us to put something back in the tank, okay? It makes us feel more excited to sort of come back to the people in our lives that live in our home. And I also think it's good for our kids to start seeing us step out a little more often. It's okay for our kids to even miss us, right? Because when they miss us, then they appreciate us. So this idea of stepping out, stepping away, I just am here to give each of you permission to do that without the guilt or the worry that it's you need to be present all the time, right? I think when we step out and step away, we come back to our relationships and our home with sort of a renewed sense of energy. And I think that can feel really good. The second one is quiet your writing reflex. So what do I mean by that? So as parents, our writing reflexes are highly developed. And that's that urge in all of us when our kid comes to us with a problem to kind of step in and fix it, right? And I'm sure we can all agree that when they're younger, that's a lot easier. But as they become older, right, our teenagers, they're not as inclined to really listen to what we have to say as much. Okay. So I try to counter that writing reflex when I hear it come up for myself, when I kind of come at a kid and I want to fix it. The way that I can sort of quiet that is I can use empathy instead. So, empathy is this amazing relationship tool. And what does empathy look like? Empathy is just saying to a kid, wow, that really stinks. Or, yeah, I can see why that feels really hard for you. Or, geez, I totally get why you're having a hard day today, right? We're validating their experience, okay? And that has a direct impact on the quality of the relationship between the two of you, okay? So use empathy. It's really helpful, especially when there's no clear-cut answer to a problem, right? You're just basically holding the space, but you're showing your kid, listen, I'm here with you, okay? The third is, or we've hit use empathy. The fourth is one-on-one, you decide. And here's what I mean by that. I don't know about you all, but I feel like for the past year, we've been moving a lot as a family, and I'm a family of 6. So that feels like a lot of people all the time. I'm going to try to use the spring to sort of break that up a little bit and focus on spending some alone time with each of my teenagers. And in those opportunities, I'm also going to ask my teen to sort of decide how we spend the time, even if it's just 20, 30 minutes, right? Let your teen decide. Maybe they want to take you to do something. Maybe you're just going for a walk. Maybe they're going to show you the newest song they learned on their guitar. But I'm going to be clear in spending time with my teenager that I'm really sort of moving from the role of manager, which I think many of us moms sort of operate in, to the role of passenger. Okay. That can be an incredibly fulfilling contributor to your teen child relationship, teen parent relationship. The other is boundary setting. Okay, so I think this is worth noting. As our teens get older, I think something that I found helps me a lot is to manage my expectations around sorry, I can never say this word, by how reciprocal the relationship is going to be. So what do I mean by that? So when I'm working with one of my kids, talking to one of my kids, and let's say, for example, we're having a conversation about a rule or something that's limiting to them, okay? Something that's boundary setting. I know that my child's response will not be one in which they sort of come and high five me and be like, thanks for that, Mom. I really appreciate you, right? And so if I can depersonalize the interaction so that it still feels productive to me, that can really contribute to a good relationship with my child. Because I think often as parents, we can personalize sometimes some of the interactions with our teens. And I'm here just to remind you that if we can manage our expectations, if we know that they're not always going to like what we have to say, and that we don't necessarily need to have like a pat on the back or a high five, we can remind ourselves that those are still important moments in terms of boundary setting and really creating a healthy, respectful parent-child relationship. And then the last one here is one of my favorites, another back pocket, which is just when you've got a kid that comes to you about something, I'll just say, hey, am I just listening right now, or do you actually want some help or support? Okay. And you can imagine that 9 out of 10 times our kids are usually just wanting us to listen. Okay. So I often use that with my own kids.
I have to say, Andre, that's one of my favorites. Do you want help or do you want me to listen? That's definitely one I'll keep in my back pocket.
It's good. I think it's helpful for us as parents because it frames sort of our next steps. Mm-hmm. Stacey, any questions coming up at this point?
There are no questions in the chat right now, but again, feel free if anyone would like to send them to me, they just come to me. So in talking about that, we've been home a lot and our kids have been home a lot, and we just got the exciting news that they will be returning next week full-time, phasing in. But since they have been home and they still will continue to be home, how do we help develop their independence and autonomy when they're home so much more?
Great question. And in my mind, that's like a complete oxymoron. Home more with growing independence. They don't necessarily seem to link up very well in my mind. And yet there are some really significant, easy ways that our kids are still developing that sense of independence, right? And just from a developmental perspective, we want to keep in mind that that's so very important for our teenagers, right? They need to be sort of spreading their wings. They need to be pulling out from us, leaving us. And so the question becomes, well, how in the world are they doing that when they're home so much? But I'm guessing that your kids are actually doing it more than you realize. So I'm just going to give you a few examples and kind of get you thinking about, oh yeah, my kids are sort of practicing their independence even though they're home, right? So first and foremost, looking for spaces in your home where they can absorb some responsibility, and kind of like chores is an easy place to see that happening, whatever you call them in your home, right? It's sort of, how is your teen contributing to the care and keeping of your home, right? And so that, you know, in those moments and in those exercises and activities that they're responsible for, those are in really important ways that they're developing their autonomy, and also really developing self-efficacy, which is, self-efficacy is this feeling that I can do something. And kids can really learn how to do that when they help us take care of our homes, okay? Taking advantage of moments, especially on the weekends, where your teen is kind of in the driver's seat around their schedule. So on a weekend morning, I'll usually ask my older teens like, hey, what's your plan today? Or what's your schedule look like today, right? It really puts the ball in their court in terms of kind of negotiating their day. And obviously it's easier if you have kids that are driving, and, you know, that sets up some independence in its own right. But that can be a really helpful question, right? Letting our kids kind of navigate their schedules during the weekend. If you have multiple kids, put your older teenagers in charge of younger kids. That's a beautiful way to be building that independence. Another easy area in my mind where kids are developing independence is around the management of their academic lives. Now, it sounds like many of you, your kids have been managing school from home. So that in itself has created, I'm guessing, many opportunities for them to be building that independence, right? But, you know, they should be reaching out to teachers on their behalf independently. They should be able to map out long-term assignments more independently. They should be learning to prioritize assignments and academic responsibilities. Those are all important moments for them to be exercising their independence, okay? So if your inclination is to be very much a part of that process, I would encourage you to look for moments where you can step out of that a little bit and let your kid kind of run that part of their lives a little more independently. I'm often asking myself, how is my child in the driver's seat as it relates to their academic experiences? That kind of helps to remind me to pull out a little bit. Other ways, little ways that they can be building independence is having them do things for themselves that we typically were doing for them when they were younger, like setting up doctor's appointments or their well visits or their teeth cleaning appointments. If they drive, setting up, you know, oil changes and helping with responsibilities in terms of caring for the cars, things like that. So just little moments that come up that present themselves that I think we as parents get in the habit of doing for them. Try to pause for a moment and ask yourself, if your kid is able to do these things, they should be doing them for themselves. Does that make sense?
Those are some great points. And Andre, we have a question here that I think a lot of parents can relate to. How do we foster independence and not nag when the at-home default activity is being on their phones or playing video games more than we would like?
I have no answer for you. I'm sorry. That is like the $1 million question. You know, one way I try to frame the technology piece, and I don't ask again if this isn't getting at your question, but I think if you're clear with your kids around what are the things that have to happen in a given day, then we can be a little more flexible about the more time many of our kids are spending on technology, and then we can nag less. So I would say it's sort of a lot of work up front, which is, here are your non-negotiables, kid. Here are the things that absolutely have to happen in a day. And once those things are done, then we can be flexible about being on your phone more than you might normally be. Or does that make sense? So, the nagging part to me is a symptom, right? So if we find ourselves nagging, it means things aren't getting done in a way that we're expecting them to get done. And so I use that as kind of a reminder to sort of pause for a second and think about what is it that's supposed to be getting done that's not. And just regrouping with, especially, with teenagers, they can have these conversations. And even if it means like writing these things down on a Post-it and sticking it on your kid's desk, I find that can be helpful. So use that as a cue. If you find yourself nagging a lot, figure out what's missing, and then how do you get that sort of back into your home life with your child? Does that answer that?
It does, and I like that regrouping, because I think parents during the pandemic, we've all probably had our guidelines, but we've been flex on them, and maybe we allow more screen time, or we allow more of something we didn't. So it's
Totally.
now looking again and say, let's regroup. Yes, this was the pandemic. This is the way we did it during then, but now we're going to revisit and we're going to figure out what's going to work and be healthy as we move forward. So I think that was very helpful.
And I think the natural transition into springtime and better weather is going to sort of get a lot of us rethinking about, moving away from how we existed in the winter, because the winter, it was a cold winter and snowy. So our kids were inside more and they were probably on technology more. But now with the shift of spring, we can use it as a great time to regroup with the family and sort of be explicit again around like, okay, everybody needs to be outside at some point today. Everybody needs to be moving their bodies at some point, right? Like I think the change of seasons will sort of naturally move us into that direction.
I completely agree. And like I said, this weather is phenomenal. So let's keep it rolling. So there are definitely some common parenting concerns, and I think parents on this Zoom will be able to relate. Certain things we might ask ourselves: is it normal that my teens spend so much time in their room? Is it normal that they're up so late, that they're always irritable, emotional, and of course that they take it out on us parents? So I think we can all relate to that a little bit.
For sure. All right, I'm going to whiz through these because I'm watching our time too. So let's talk a little bit about being holed up in their rooms. Yes, yes, yes. Absolutely normal and developmentally appropriate, right? They crave privacy and they find it in their rooms with their doors shut. And I always laugh when I talk to parents about this, because myself, I'm very much in this camp where I'm constantly walking past closed doors upstairs. And in my mind, with like the laundry basket of clothes, I'm thinking, what is going on in there? And if I'll do the occasional like knock and peek, I'll often just find a kid like with headphones in on the bed doing homework, sort of looking at me like, yes, and then I shut the door and carry on. But yeah, so this is completely normal and appropriate. But here's the thing. They need to get out of their rooms, though, not only just to be fed, but just to have anything that is missing as a result of them being in their rooms, we need to make sure is happening. So what do I mean? It's okay for them to spend a lot of time in their room with the door shut, as long as they're also, interacting with the family, or part of our family dinners, or getting outside, right? So I think, we just have to listen to our gut as parents around this. And when we feel like it's been enough time, it's a little knock on the door. Hey, come down and join us for a little while, right? I have my 16-year-old daughter she loves her room. So my husband and I joke, because she just comes down periodically, but it's only for like 10 or 12 minutes maximum. And then we'll be actually still talking to her and realize she's not in front of us anymore and has gone back up to her room and closed the door. So I think the simple answer is yes, but I do think, especially given how much schooling has been going on in kids' bedrooms, it's really important that we're also getting them out of their rooms. And their inclination is going to be to stay there forever. And it's our job to pull them out. I think our teenagers start to sort of imagine that their bedrooms are like their apartments, right? And they're actually already starting to make that transition out of our homes. So, does that make sense, Stacey?
It completely makes sense, and everything you said was so relatable.
Good. That makes me feel better too. Okay. Is it normal that my kid is up so late? Yes, it's super normal. Well, one of the reasons why that's happening is, again, back to the way their brains are developing. So melatonin, which is that sleep hormone, which makes all of us feel tired, in an adolescent brain, it does not get released until up to 2 hours later than it does in an adult brain, right? So think.
Oh, Andre, you ended up muted. Sorry.
Hold on. There we go. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay, so our kids are staying up later because the melatonin gets released into their systems later. Okay, so that's just a biological process that's occurring, and that's really related to the way their brains are developing. I think it makes it harder for our kids to fall asleep at night. And I also think on the flip side, it makes it harder for them to get moving in the morning because the melatonin stays in their systems longer than it does in ours. Okay. But here's what I want to say about sleep. This is one area I feel super strongly about. We have to protect sleep for our kids. We know that sleep is a protective factor for good mental health. And if you ask me, one of the reasons why anxiety is on the rise outside of all the sort of usual suspects, I think it's also on the rise because our teenagers are not getting enough sleep. They should be getting 8 to 10 hours of sleep. If you can get 7 to 8, I think that's a good night. Okay. So I think we have to be really clear around tech-free rooms at night when they're sleeping and have some idea of a lights out time. Our kids aren't going to naturally do that for themselves. And that's where I think we can step in as parents. Is it normal that my kid, my teenager, is irritable and emotional? Yes. So here's the thing, right? The surge of hormones that so many of our teenagers are experiencing as a result of puberty can really affect their brains. And that can contribute to the moodiness we see, okay? Additionally, I mentioned that they process many of their experiences through the amygdala, which is highly emotional, okay? So when they're interpreting many of their experiences through that area of the brain, it makes sense to us why they tend to be sort of highly emotive. It's like those moments when you're talking with your kid and you're thinking to yourself, I actually don't even know if we're having the same conversation, because their response sort of seems a lot more intense. Okay. So hopefully that helps to frame sort of why it can be like that with them. And then the last one, is it normal that my kid takes things out on me? And I put the punching bag there because I often think of myself as such. Here's how I try to frame this for myself, right? Our kids, for the most part, are really holding it together for a good part of their school day, even if they're doing school from home, right? There's a level of compliance and being agreeable that they have to put forth all day so that when they get home or when they are finished with school, they need a release, right? And in that process, I think we often experience that blowback, okay? So just understanding that, I think, can be helpful so that we don't personalize their reactions to us, right? And I think if I can just be okay kind of holding up in that space as a neutral place for the emotion to land, I do find that my kids kind of right themselves and can carry on in a better way once they've sort of unloaded, right? I often think of Lisa D'Amour. I know you guys were hosting her a week ago. In Untangled, she explains how we as parents are like the walls of a swimming pool, okay? And I love this. I think about this all the time. Our teenagers are in the deep end. They're frolicking, they're swimming, they're somersaulting, they're diving in, they're jumping in, they're having a grand old time. But eventually they get tired and they need to come back to the wall, right? And that's when they come and they rest. And as soon as they've rested, it's like they shove away, right, and go back to the middle of the pool where they are supposed to be. So if we can remind ourselves that one of our really important jobs is we just kind of have to hold that wall. We need to be there for them to kind of come back to and hang on and catch their breath before they sort of shove off and go back to the middle of the pool. Stacy, how does that work for you? Did that answer those?
It did. That was great. I love the punching bag one. It makes me laugh, and I feel like we need to laugh during this time.
For sure.
If you had one tip for us that we as parents could take away right now, what is it that we should be focusing on?
Here's my answer to this, and I put this image of sort of this harbor. It's similar to Lisa D'Amour's swimming pool metaphor. I think what our kids need from us is so basic. It's this idea of the secure attachment. They need to feel seen by us. They need to be heard by us. And when we use empathy with them, they feel both of those. They need to feel soothed. So when they come at us with high emotion, we can sort of stay neutral, right? And we can co-regulate with them to get them to calm down. And they need to feel safe, which I know we're all working really hard to provide that safety for our kids, right? Lisa D'Amour, again, I think in her presentation last week, I loved how she said, we need to be a predictable presence. Our kids need to know what they can expect from us. But more than all of that, for me, it comes down to just providing this safe harbor for my kids. I imagine that each of my teenagers is the captain of their own ship. And they are out in sort of the seas. And sometimes seas are calm and they can stay out there. And sometimes seas get rough and they need to come back into my harbor, right? And when they come back into the harbor, they need to restock. They need to refuel, right? They need to just breathe before they can go back out to sea. So I just try to remind myself that if I can provide that sort of safe harbor for my kids right now, that is enough, right? That is good enough. So that would be my response, right? Just creating this safety, this space, this sense of safety for each of them so that they can get themselves back out to sea, if you will.
I love that, Andre, and I love what you said, that is good enough. I think parents need to know what we are doing is good enough and that we're doing a good job. So as we kind of close out here, what can you tell us about what we can do in these upcoming months for us to recharge personally, professionally, in our own family lives, just to help us reboot our systems, have an extra spring in our step, and just kind of move on?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I would argue we're all probably feeling similarly in terms of the weather changing is probably making all of us feel better, right? But here's the way I'm seeing this. I feel like I'm a runner and I'm thinking that we're all at mile 22 of the marathon, right? Usually around mile 21, 22 is when we hit that wall, right? And when we hit that wall, it's like, I really don't think I can finish this, right? And I just want to mention this idea of positive expectancy. And what that means, it's a belief that things will get better. And it really does contribute to a lighter mindset, and it's super contagious. Okay. So just trying to have the expectation that regardless of where we're all currently, things are going to get better. And if we can practice saying that to ourselves and we can model that for our kids, it can be a very contagious, energizing mindset. Along with that, in my private practice, I do a lot of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And one of sort of the important tenets of CBT is doing some cognitive restructuring. And the whole gist of that is really saying that we all have situations that are making us feel anxious. And it's not the situation that creates the anxiety. It's how we think about the situations. So if we can choose perspectives that are helpful and energizing, that can contribute to a sort of healthier mindset. So let me just give you a really quick example of what I mean by this. I want you to imagine the situation is the same for all of us, which is basically we all have pandemic fatigue, okay? And when we are in that space, we may think to ourselves, oh, I can't do this anymore. okay? And as a result of having that thought, I may feel really hopeless. And my response may be that I'm just totally unmotivated and I'm letting things go around my parenting. I think we can all relate to that, okay? Now I'm gonna say, okay, that's one perspective. What if we choose a perspective that's actually a little more helpful? Because if I'm letting things go in my parenting, that's not really that helpful. So now I'm gonna say it's the same situation. We're all experiencing pandemic fatigue. But this time I'm gonna think to myself, you know what? I'm really looking forward to the warmer weather and time outside. Therefore, I'm feeling hope. I'm feeling optimistic. I'm feeling more positive. And my response is going to be, maybe I'll plan an outing with a kid. Maybe I'll plan a weekend away with a friend. Whatever the response is, I think you can all see that it's a more helpful, energizing response than sort of the like letting things slide. Okay. So just choosing our perspective, we have a lot of control over that. Another thought, anticipating family needs around outdoor time and using this moment to get prepared. So, you know, if you need more Adirondack chairs or a fire pit or a trampoline or a new wiffle ball net or ball, whatever it is, bat or ball, just anticipating that we're going to be moving more of our lives outside and getting prepared around that can feel re-energizing. Shifting from the family to smaller groupings. Like I mentioned, I think we, at least in my family, we have been moving as a mass unit and it's exhausting. So I'm going to refocus on smaller groupings, one-on-one time with kids, letting siblings spend one-on-one time together, sending one child with an aunt or a grandparent when that's available, but just shifting from sort of this mass group to smaller groupings, I think can be really re-energizing. And you know, many of you know with multiple kids, if you move one kid out of the equation, the whole family dynamic can change. And so really taking advantage of that. Other few ones, reconnect with important people in your life. You know, we as adults, we also need our friendships, and those friendships can really serve to put something back in our tanks, which then allow us to come back to our families feeling a little more energized, so a little more happy to be back with these people we love so much. So be thinking about how you can do that for yourself. And then the last two. So this last one, make some plans and then stay right where you are. What do I mean by that? So, you know, with the shifting of guidelines, we have a little more maneuverability around making some potential plans for our families. I don't know what that looks like for each of you, but I at least feel like there's a little more wiggle room starting to happen for our family and maybe seeing relatives or traveling eventually. And so that makes me feel energized when I start to think about some planning. And yet, we know that one of the most important ways to deal with a lot of the uncertainty we're still feeling is to stay present-minded. So I think we need to pick and choose moments where we can be a little more forward-thinking and moments where that doesn't serve us, that makes us feel anxious, and come back to sort of being present-minded, right? And sort of staying right where we are. And then the last one is just a reminder that we don't need to be jumping in right away to sort of how life is presenting itself to us as we move through the spring. We can wade in. And what do I mean by that? As I start to think about summer and my kids' home, I can start to imagine, and it feels good for me to maybe think about signing a kid up for something and yet still giving myself permission to play things by ear, right? So it's this interplay of hope and realism, and that can feel both exciting and safe all at the same time. So those are a few thoughts about ways to feel re-energized as we move into spring. Stacy, anything coming up in the chat? I'd love to hear if anybody, I know we're like 5 minutes out, if anybody had something that they are planning to do for the spring or are already doing for themselves that feels good that you would share with the group.
That would be great. If anyone wants to unmute and share, you don't have to put your video on.
I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. There we go.
I just had a question. As I think about our high school students, we have freshmen who this is high school this year, even though we were fortunate to be in school more than some other areas. There's still so many, you're wearing a mask and the clubs are virtual, everything's virtual. And it was hard to integrate. And even our sophomores who maybe they were just finding their way around the building last year and, whoosh. So they've all, they were on a trajectory to find their way, socially and find their comfort level at the high school. And that, kind of ended for some, and some have proceeded on. I don't know if you have any guidance on how to get them back when the time is right, on the path that they normally would have had through normal high school years.
Do you mean if that creates some anxiety for kids, the idea of going back to what it was?
Right. Either anxiety or just how do I reconnect in the way that, they would have normally just naturally done over there, finding their way around the school, et cetera.
Yeah. And I mean, I think especially as your kids are heading back to school full time again, I would put a lot of stock and faith in the school and the teachers and the staff in the building that are going to have to, in some ways, take a few steps back and in a way start over again with some of these procedures and transitions. And right. I think because they're all in the same boat, it's like we can't just pick up where we left off. You know what I'm saying? It's like we do have to kind of go back and start at the beginning in some ways, because things are going to feel very new again. And even things that feel familiar, there's still going to be an aspect of newness to it because we're coming at them still with like social distancing and masks, and you know what I'm saying? So help me understand more specifically what your question is. I don't know if I'm getting at it there. Are you asking as a parent, like, how do I support my kid in those spaces?
Yeah. How do we support them in just, finding their way back to normal?
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is where, like, as parents, we kind of fake it till we make it. We are going to just assume that they're going to get through this time. We can say out loud, listen, like, you're going back to school. There's going to be things that feel familiar to you, and there's probably going to be a lot of things that don't. I think just naming it and making sure that our kids hear us sort of putting words to what they may feel but can't articulate themselves can be really helpful, right? Just helping them to anticipate what it might feel like, and also recognizing that it may not feel great for a while. And I think that's appropriate and normal given that you haven't been in the building for so long on a consistent basis. So I think just having that conversation could be really helpful. And then, we are the captains of these ships, so if we stay calm, our kids generally stay calm. So I think the more sort of we can come at this from this attitude of like, yep, it's going to be different and it may not feel great, but we know you got this, is a better approach than like, oh, I can't believe you're finally going back. And you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm being a little bit dramatic, but I think we just sort of be really steady, even though inside we may ourselves feel anxious about it. The more we can be steady about it, the more steady our kids will be. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's helpful.
Andre, is there a way to encourage the kids to integrate again since they've been so removed? Any advice on that?
I think we have to be really patient as parents, to be honest, because I think you guys know the more we push them, the more they resist. You know what I'm saying? So I think just being patient, being open to conversations, checking in. It's going to take some time for them. It's going to present new anxieties for our kids, for every kid in some shape or form. So I think just normalizing that for our kids can be really helpful, but I think we have to be really patient as parents and just give them the time and space to transition back. And also, have some faith in the school and that teachers and faculty, they're going to be working with us to get our kids transitioned again. And use your school. If there's something that you're worried about, find your school counselor or a teacher that your kid likes, or an adult in the building that can shed some perspective on what they're seeing on their end too. Because we can create our own stories around what we imagine to be at school, but the adults at school have a different lens and different perspective.
Great, thank you. Well, we're just at 10:32, and I always like to respect people's time. So last call for questions. I don't see any more or anything in the chat. So with that, I just want to say thank you to Andre, to Courtney, to Jody, to Mr. Egan, and for all of you joining today. I hope some of the common parenting questions we all have been answered, and you can walk away with some valuable tips and tools to help you as we move into spring and start enjoying our world as it opens up a little bit again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming
Yeah, thank you so much.
so much.
You're so welcome. It was my pleasure. Best of luck next week. I'm getting everybody back to school.
Thank you.